Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa from the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Over the next 30 minutes, we'll be taking you on a journey of all the top business content you need to know about in Africa, right here from Cairo all the way to Johannesburg and Nairobi all the way to Lagos. We've got plenty of content coming up in the next half hour. Here's what's coming up. Leaders of the 5 BRIC nations meet for the first working session in Brazil with plans to create a development bank at the top of the agenda. You've heard about the violence at the Kenyan coastline, which is robbing the country of much-needed investment. But what is the context around it? And Zimbabwe's quest to revive electricity output to resuscitate its ailing economy is also in focus tonight.
Surpassing the G7 in growth, setting global records in travel, and making history in space. But will the BRICS overcome their divisions to create a new global development bank? Join CCTV America for unprecedented coverage from and about the 5 nations that make up the BRICS Summit. Only on CCTV.
Perhaps fittingly then, let's start with the 6th annual BRICS Summit. It's currently underway in the city of Fortaleza in Brazil. Leaders of the countries in that group, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, have held their first working session. The summit is being described as a watershed event for the bloc, especially with the imminent launch of a new development bank. Here's CCTV's Sumitra Naidu with more.
This year's gathering is one of the most significant for the BRICS grouping. High on the agenda is the new BRICS Development Bank. The establishment of the bank will signal a new era in global financial institutions.
When you've got a finalized BRICS Development Bank, it changes the nature of how we understand the BRICS engagement. It moves away from a political talk shop to something that's real and something that's significant.
For years, emerging markets and less developed nations have called for reform in institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. Analysts believe a new development bank under the emerging world will lead to speedier transformation.
South Africa, for example, would really like the BRICS Bank to give loans to other African states to assist with African development. The other big question is whether or not other major developing countries, particularly the likes of Turkey, Indonesia and Nigeria, will be able to join the bank.
There's been much talk about the BRICS Development Bank since it was first agreed to back in 2012. It's hoped that at this year's BRICS Summit, there would be more finalization around where the bank would be based, who the president would be, and how much each country would need to contribute. It's expected that there will be an initial capital investment of $10 billion from each of the 5 member states to fund the project. There will also be a currency reserve arrangement for times of crises. It is also unclear whether the bank will stay exclusive to the BRICS countries. BRICS will also have to take a stance on the issue of Russia and the Crimean War. There is also a new leadership in India, and this will be Prime Minister Narendra Modi's first multilateral meeting.
He's got a history in terms of running the most successful state in India, a state that's managed to attract the most amount of foreign direct investment. And Prime Minister Narendra Modi has got significant charisma. And how does he bring that charisma to the table at Fortaleza in Rio this week?
The BRICS leaders will also look at issues of trade and easier mobility between the 5 countries, issues that have in the past proved a challenge.
The BRICS aren't so willing or aren't so able to cooperate easily on trade. They can't, for example, create a free trade agreement because everyone is scared of entering into an agreement with China effectively because China is so productive and so efficient.
No doubt there will be more challenges ahead as the leaders look for amicable solutions on how to create stronger business ties between their nations without interfering in each of the countries' policies. Sumitra Naidu, CCTV, Johannesburg.
Now then, let's talk about Ghana. It plans to double the value of exports, including cocoa, timber, oil, gold and other minerals over the next 4 years as part of efforts to stabilize the cedi. The world's second largest cocoa producer aims to have non-traditional exports worth about $5 billion in 2017, up from about $2.4 billion last year. Its currency is about 30% weaker so far against the American dollar. That's the biggest decline of any single currency among the 24 that are tracked by analysts. Now, the West African nation exports fell to $5.9 billion in the first 5 months of 2014 compared to $6.3 billion a year earlier. Imports were down to $6 billion as well from $7.3 billion over the same time frame. Africa's second biggest gold producer after South Africa, plans to set up an export advisory council to boost export volumes and earnings as well in the future. Over in Kenya, since the middle of June, a wave of fairly brutal violence has swept through the Kenyan coastline. Now, the government's response, a mix of rhetoric, political point scoring and ineffective internal security, has left both citizens and investors deeply concerned. But it's worth stepping back at this point to ask exactly how did Kenya get here and what's the context in which this violence is taking place? Well, since about the middle of June, about 100 people have been killed by gunmen in a wave of attacks that have been concentrated around Lamu. That's roughly 300 kilometers northeast of Mombasa. Dozens have been arrested, but there have been no convictions. Adding to the confusion, Al-Shabaab has repeatedly claimed responsibility for these attacks. They claim they are revenge for Kenya's deployment of troops in Somalia. Not so, claims Uhuru Kenyatta, Kenya's 52-year-old president. He blames local political networks instead. What is at stake here? Well, for starters, land-related injustices running all the way back to the 60s. Coastal residents say they're treated like squatters on ancestral land with no formal documentation. Further compounding the problem, two key developments. The first, the construction of Kenya's second major port in Lamu. It's part of a burst of port building in East Africa at about $5.3 billion. Earlier this year as well, Pan-Continental Oil and Gas reported finding oil off the coast of Lamu. The company reckons there might be up to 3 billion barrels of oil or 10 trillion cubic feet of natural gas lying down there. Now then, let's put matters at the coast into their proper context. I'm now joined in studio by Betty Murungi. She's a Vice Chair of the Kenya Human Rights Commission and as a lawyer has significant expertise in transitional justice matters, not just in Kenya, but across the rest of Africa as well. Thank you for your time this evening.
Thank you for having me here.
Land issues at the coast have been such a defining hallmark of all the violence that's taking place over there. Is that arguably the root cause of what we've seen happening from Mombasa all the way to Mpeketoni as well?
It certainly plays a very major role. The land problems at the coast go back even before the 1960s. It's been like a triple kind of marginalization for the coastal residents. First, by the British, then by the Arabs, or, first by the Arabs and then by the British, and then by the independence government. The land regime in Kenya at the coast after independence meant that most of the land became government land. And that's how come the residents then became squatters. To compound the problem, there are some indigenous communities in the coastal region, in Lamu in particular, the Bajuni, who have been again excluded from becoming titled owners of their own property. Part of the problem that we've been talking about in the recent past and that was investigated by the Truth Commission is the question of the people who were settled in Lamu. People from upcountry, Kenyans, yes, but they came in large numbers. Up to 20% of the entire population of Lamu district came from upcountry and were settled. Now, none of them, of course, have titles because the land is government land, but in the area that the port that you've alluded to is being built, some people were able to get titles. Now, most of those titled people at the coast where the port is going to be built are not indigenous coastal population. And this is what is fueling this discontent. And this is what is also, causing a lot of anxiety amongst the communities.
Indeed. Looking at what post-colonial governments have done, however, and I'm referring to the work that was done by the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission, of which you are part briefly, post-colonial governments in Kenya have done virtually nothing to redress any of these land-related issues. They just keep kicking the can somewhere down the road, ignoring it and saying, oh, well, the next guy who comes in will probably deal with that.
Yeah, but no guy is going to do it because all the governments that you're talking about have been implicated in some of the corruption that has taken place in the illegal allocation of public land. Lamu land and coastal lands and all the other lands that had been investigated by the Ndungu Land Commission were illegally and corruptly allocated, not just to settlers, but also to people in authority. Now,
individuals in government.
Individuals in government. And that is why you have seen that we have been unable, the governments, successive governments have been unable to implement any of those reports that have called for really drastic measures to deal with the land problems that we have seen.
Is it a case of them being unable or unwilling?
Both. They are unable and unwilling, but more unwilling. They are unable because they set up institutions that they do not allow to exercise their mandate. For example, the Constitution has set up the Land Commission. This Land Commission is the body that was instituted by the land policy that was passed by the last Kibaki regime to tackle the land problems in this country, the communal land problems, the individual land problems, and so on. But this Land Commission has been undermined. It has been unable to do its work, and I can bet you it's going to, face bottlenecks all along the way. The Truth Commission report is now 1 year out of time without implementation. And it doesn't look likely that anybody is going to implement this Truth Commission report. And that is because, obviously, a lot of people who are still in power and still in authority are implicated in all of these reports.
And therefore they have no incentive to actually do anything about it.
Yes.
Let's talk about something that the government is doing. The
Yes.
Statute Law Miscellaneous Amendments Bill has this rather curious provision that essentially allows the executive, assuming it's passed, to deploy the military to deal with internal security issues without explicit authority from Parliament. This militarization surely has got to have significant repercussions somewhere down the line.
It will. And, it will be curious and quite outrageous if, that bill passes in Parliament, assuming it hasn't passed, because of the antecedents of military intervention in internal security matters.
And like what happened in Mount Elgon in 2008,
Mount Elgon, what happened in Wagala, that was as a direct result of utilizing the military to deal with a security problem. It will be interesting to see whether any member of parliament from the northeastern province is going to actually put their name on this bill. But, government uses miscellaneous amendments legislation to bring in, amendments to legislation and in effect actually kind of amend the Constitution because it is completely illegal and unlawful for this to happen. But clearly, if you can get the law, changed through a miscellaneous amendment bill, then of course the president will be acting within his authority. But this is where the opposition now needs to really start taking their work in Parliament seriously. But not just the opposition. Members of Parliament are elected to Parliament as representatives of constituents. Those constituents would want to know why military is being deployed
instead of actually reforming
in a
the
case where there is no state of emergency. Of course, if Kenya was in a state of emergency, the president is within his powers to deploy military to deal with any internal situation.
But right now, certainly not.
Certainly not, and certainly not without the consent of Parliament.
All right. Unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you very much for your insights this evening.
Thank you.
That has been Betty Murungi, Vice Chair of the Kenya Human Rights Commission, in studio with me right now. Let's make a quick run through the markets here for you. A fairly positive day across equity markets across Africa, with the exception, however, of the NSE 20 in the Kenyan capital, down about a quarter, and the JAC over in Ghana. Fairly interesting U-turn, as you might recall, yesterday taking place with the reintroduction, or rather the removal, of subsidies shortly after the reintroduction in April. Keep it on Global Business. We've got more coming up. We'll be looking at traders in Somalia. They're alarmed as Saudi Arabia is now threatening to ban the shipment of camels following a virus outbreak. And in our ongoing series on power generation in Africa, we'll be looking at what Zimbabwe is doing to revive its neglected power plants.
African leaders have been urged to make it easier to move and do business across borders within the African continent.
Africans should be free to move in their continent, to do business, to interact, if we are to grow the levels of investment and trade that will ensure that we are able to create the jobs for our people that we require.
Welcome back. You're watching Global Business Africa from the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Now, a little early in the bulletin, we started with the BRICS summit. It's taking place in Fortaleza in Brazil. The heads of state from the 5 countries, Brazil, Russia, India and China, are meeting, plus South Africa, of course. They're all meeting over there. And right at the top of the agenda is the formation of a BRICS development bank. The idea is for all these countries to put $100 billion together and provide an alternative financing body to the IMF and the World Bank and so on. Let's find out exactly what's going on. Let's move on to Fortaleza, where CCTV's Paulo Cabral is live right now. Paulo, each country is contributing an equal amount to the initial $50 billion in capital, but will that principle of equal contributions also apply to the next round of capital raising?
Yes, look, the leaders are just meeting right now behind us here in the center of events of Ceará here in Fortaleza, and they had very intense discussions during the morning, and we're just waiting now for them to come out for the plenary session, and that's probably when we'll have more details as to how this development bank is going to be formed. It's important to say that there are some disagreements also on the table. Of course, important agreements nevertheless. They have agreed that it's important to have this bank for the BRICS countries because the World Bank and the IMF are usually more controlled by the United States, by Western Europe, and so what they want is a development bank that would really serve the interests of these 5 emerging markets initially, and then of course of other emerging nations that also may need infrastructure investments. But now there are some disagreements there, and the main one for now is exactly where the headquarters of this bank is going to be. China wants it to be in Shanghai. It is clearly supported by Russia in that regard. Brazil, a more timid support also to this. Brazil is also interested in having the headquarters of this bank in China, but India does not accept that, does not want this bank in Shanghai. They want it in Delhi, and that's the stage we're now just waiting for the leaders to come out and see if they have taken a decision on this and other important matters here in Fortaleza.
Indeed. Thank you very much for the update. That's CCTV's Paulo Cabral. He's in Fortaleza in Brazil. He'll be keeping tabs on the meetings over there and giving us updates on what's going on as and when it does happen. Now then, let's talk about Saudi Arabia. It's considering a ban on camels coming in from Somalia following the outbreak of the deadly MERS virus. Saudi scientists, of course, are still conducting various tests on camels at seaports, but there are fears that the kingdom could stop all camel imports from Somalia even before the virus is confirmed to be present or not in livestock from the Horn of Africa. Mohamed Imoge takes up the story.
70% of Somalia's animal exports go to Saudi Arabia. About 4.7 million animals were exported only last year. But that may now change. A deadly camel virus may hinder Somalia's camel exports to the kingdom. Saudi Arabia suspects a virus that has killed hundreds of people may have arrived in camels from the Horn of Africa and may consider a ban on camel imports from Somalia. But any ban on camel trade would affect the already ailing economy of this country. The MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome virus, was first reported 2 years ago. And if confirmed in Somalia's camels, it will have adverse effects. Somalia's Ministry of Livestock officials say they're not worried about the MERS virus.
Well, Saudi Arabia has every right to suspect that our camels may have brought the MERS virus, since they import most of the camels from us. Our worry is whether this is real. If it is, then that would be a serious health issue. But we don't think so because there's no indication here that MERS virus is in Somalia.
With Somalia's peak season almost due, shipments may be hindered. Most of the shipments are made just before the holiday of Eid al-Fitr, that comes exactly in 2 weeks. Authorities say the kingdom could halt camel exports as their scientists make the necessary tests. Even so, such a halt will still cost the country millions of dollars.
They can halt import, but they cannot ban until they are sure. But even halting would still grossly affect us. In our quarantines, we have foreign veterinary experts who conduct tests before we export. But until now, Saudi authorities have not communicated with us on this. But we are ready to work with them.
Somalia largely exports via its Berbera and Bosaso ports. But the camels come from all over the country, and even as far as southern Ethiopia and northern Kenya. And if Saudi Arabia does effect the ban, it could have severe economic impacts. Mohit Hirmoge, CCTV, Mogadishu.
Now, the hopes of improving Zimbabwe's economy do continue to be throttled by the country's energy crisis. You see, Zimbabwe needs roughly 2,200 megawatts of installed generation capacity. Right now, though, it has only about 1,200. The difference between those two has to be imported from neighboring countries, but Zimbabwe doesn't get enough of it to actually bridge that deficit completely. In What's Hot Tonight, Farai Makutuya has been looking at efforts to step up Zimbabwe's power output.
Well, there's a joke that is doing the rounds in Zimbabwe, and that is that the first phrase that any foreign visitor is likely to learn when they get here is Magetsi ayenda, which literally means the power is out again. Such is the frequency of power cuts here. Zimbabwe has not built any new power plant in over 40 years. Existing ones are desperately in need of refurbishment, which requires billions and cannot be done overnight. It's a bleak outlook, but there could be light at the end of the tunnel. China Africa Sunlight Energy is planning a $2.2 billion coal mining and power generation plant that will feed up to 600 megawatts, about 1/3 of Zimbabwe's total electricity needs, onto the national grid in the next 2 years. This could be the catalyst the economy needs to get going again.
Energy is the most important infrastructure. For a country to develop, energy has to develop fast.
Construction begins this month and should be completed within 24 months. Once up and running, the colliery will produce 2.4 million metric tons of coal, which will mainly be used for power generation on site. It will be Zimbabwe's first independent power plant, and unlike other thermal power stations where coal is mined off-site and then transported by a rail or road, everything will be in one location, which should increase efficiency and significantly reduce costs. It's a staggering amount of money that is required, but the project promoters are confident this will not suffer the stillbirth that other power projects have in recent years.
This is not a government project, it is actually a private-owned company project. So the process that the government goes through to get resources is actually different. So this one, rest assured that this project is going to take off the ground on time as we have planned it to be.
Thousands will be employed and even more jobs created in industries that are set to be rejuvenated once the power headache is solved. In fact, the project has been awarded national project status in recognition of its importance in helping turn around Zimbabwe's fortunes. Farai Makutuya, CCTV, Harare, Zimbabwe.
Quick run through the commodities here for you just before we jump into the break. Not much movement with regards to crude oil or gold or any of the commodities really that we track here for you. The interesting part behind the story, however, comes in from Nigeria. Look at the first quarter GDP numbers coming out. They expect the economy to grow by about 6.2% so far this year, but oil production has been in significant decline. We'll be looking at that in a little more detail later on in Global Business. When we come back, we'll be looking on Klatscher Glass. It's a unique and affordable vehicle glass installation business, and it's being run by a woman in one of South Africa's impoverished townships. We'll have the details next. Welcome back to the program. You're watching Global Business Africa. On a day when we've got some fairly interesting currency news. However, we'll get to that in a little moment. But first, let's take you to South Africa, where a young female entrepreneur overcomes several challenges to open up an affordable vehicle glass installation business in Cape Town. Now, she started, as most businesses usually do, with just an idea. But in Grassroots tonight, we focus on how she managed to plug a gap in the market for those looking for an affordable glass installation. Here's CCTV's Travan Andrews with more.
In South Africa's impoverished townships, there remains very few opportunities for most. And for some pursuing unique business ideas, it can be just as daunting. But for 35-year-old Khayelitsha resident Tempi Totsetsi, her dream of becoming a successful female entrepreneur was just too strong. And that drove her to start Culture Market.
I saw a gap in the township because fact is people do own vehicles, but not all of them have insurances. So I decided to open Culture Class to cater for those people who do not have insurances and give them a good quality classes at affordable prices.
Running a business from her home does pose some challenges. Small business owners from the townships get very little assistance in the form of startup money or clients. But she's overcome most of the challenges, pursuing a career as the owner of a glass-fit business in a mainly male-dominated industry.
It has been difficult. It's difficult enough because it's the first of its kind in Khayelitsha, and also the fact that I'm a female. People don't think a female can do it in this industry, but I've done it and I'm still going strong.
To be competitive, she slashed her prices to half the going rate, beating off the competition and in turn also attracting new customers. For Tembi, what started with one client has now swelled to the dozens. Word has quickly got around to people in the township that the prices on offer here are just too good to beat. Her work is hands-on too. She personally monitors the quality of every job her workers undertake. Her attention to detail and service has not gone unnoticed.
I think that this Tembi Khayelitsha class service is a very good one, because you can tell that it's been overdue. It's a long overdue service here.
It's expensive to take to a dealer because even if you've got insurance, you've got to pay excess also. You see, it's very much expensive, but yeah, it's cheaper than a dealer.
Her innovative ideas also won her numerous awards. And while her business seems to be booming, she's not standing idly by, choosing whether to continue and learn from other township startups on how to keep it sustainable. Travis Andrews, CCTV, Cape Town.
Let's talk about currencies very briefly now. The cedi, of course, we covered that a little earlier with regard to Ghana. Not much change expected in the Kenyan shilling either, except, of course, maybe declining inflows from key earnings like tourism in tea and coffee. However, keep a very close eye on the South African rand. It was a little weaker based on news coming out from the NUMSA strike earlier today. Of course, the fact of the matter is NUMSA has rejected the offer from employees, and that offer has been withdrawn of a 10% wage hike in the first year, followed by 9.5% and 9% the year after that. The Naira, on the other hand, is at a 7-week high as well. Now then, just before we go, here's what we're working on for Global Business tomorrow. The leaders of Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa will conclude the summit in Fortaleza in Brazil tomorrow. We'll have detailed content on the conclusions on the launch of the new development bank in the 5 countries. Reuters, as a matter of fact, is just reporting that a deal to launch that bank has been signed. Details, however, are still pending. And that's it for this edition of Global Business. Do send your feedback to us at globalbusinessafrica@cctv.com, and wherever you are on social media, Facebook, Twitter, we're there. The news continues over there 24/7, and we'll certainly keep you up to speed with what's going on in Africa. Thank you for watching. I'm Ramanyang.